Today on the show, things in the Middle East are not cooling down, and ramifications back at home are being felt all over the place. We're going to talk about that and a little bit more here on the We the Patriots podcast. I'm your host, Sal Assante, and let's get right into the show today. So as you can see, quality might be a little down on the video. I apologize, feeling a little lazy and didn't go to the studio today. So over here in my apartment. With all that said, things in Iran are not looking too great. As expected, things are not cooling down. The regime change that Trump and Netanyahu were seeking is not really occurring the way that they probably expected. So with that, yeah, things are not cooling down whatsoever. What's been going on is that we've been striking pretty relentlessly over the past 6 or so weeks as things kind of started at the end of February there. Well, we've been attacking everything in our sight, and Israel's been doing the same. We had something like 900 strikes in the first 12 hours. Things are not at that level anymore, but with all that said, it's still pretty egregious what's going on. And I think it's important to pay attention as much as you kind of don't know what Trump is doing or whether what he says is actually correlating to reality. I think it's important to take what he says and try to analyze it to a certain degree. So there have been multiple times, including in his speech to the country, it was Wednesday or Thursday of last week, in which he continued to say that he's negotiating with Iran. But every single time that ends up happening, Iran comes out and puts out a statement saying that Trump has not negotiated with anybody of note and that it's all false. They even used his own words against him, calling it fake news. And it's just getting to a point where it's ridiculous. Things are not, again, cooling down in any way, shape, or form. And if anything, backlash is coming here in the States pretty heavily. Now, what we saw in that speech, I think, is important to point out. There was a point in the speech where Trump is essentially saying that the United States and Israel have done the hard part, and now that the easy part is for the countries that are directly affected by the closing of the Strait of Hormuz, or the effect of closing, I should say, that they have to go do the easy part, and that's open it up. And that's really, I think, was the biggest thing to come out of that speech last week. And I think it needs a little bit of analysis. So first and foremost, I think it's important for everybody here to remember that the Strait of Hormuz was not closed in any way, shape, or form before these attacks. So essentially, what has happened is that the United States and Israel have caused the economic crisis that is the closing of the Strait of Hormuz. And I want to just make a point here. I keep saying closing, but what's really happening is Iran is essentially holding it hostage and charging, thought I saw something like $2 million per vessel that comes through. That could be true, that could be false. But what it really comes down to is that it's not de facto closed, but what it is that it's essentially become a racket for Iran, where that racket did not exist prior to the attack. So what the United States and Israel have done is essentially caused a crisis that didn't have to. It's estimated that somewhere between 20 and 35% of all of the world's oil travels through that Strait of Hormuz. So you have to think, and we have seen the effects here at home. If you're living here in the United States, if you're across the globe, I'm sure you're seeing very similar issues. And that's the fact that price of oil, regardless of where you are, whether your supply is directly impacted by the closing of the strait, your prices have gone up exponentially. And the reason for that, I think, is also important to kind of just mention. I don't have an exact way of describing it other than the fact that it is a global market when it comes to oil prices and therefore any petroleum products that come down the line, whether you talk about plastics, gasoline, some even medical technology, medicine itself. Any of this that may get affected is going to have its price increased because of the now impacted global market on oil. Now, with that said, you're seeing a lot of tangential effects, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But all in all, I think it's important to take away that because of our actions in late February and early March, the world is now feeling a real squeeze in terms of the economic side of things. And it's affecting different countries in different ways. Like for us, for example, in the United States, our prices of gasoline, diesel fuel have gone up pretty tremendously over the past month and a half or so. But in places like Korea, they are actually going to some sort of a ration. So even something, can't verify whether this is true, but they're going back to a policy that was enacted, I believe, during the first Gulf War. Correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially what it is on and off driving, depending on your license plate. If it, if it's an odd number or an even number or something along those lines, you can drive this day, you can't drive the next day. And that is not the only place that's starting to ration off their fuel supply. And it's a crazy thought to think that something like that might come to the United States. Now, more than likely it won't. What it seems like Trump is wanting to do is try to make the United States the global seller of oil and petroleum products. Now, with that said, if we don't have an ability to get to certain countries, then that's kind of a moot point. Regardless, that seems to be the way that Trump is kind of going about it. The only problem is that the prices are not going to come down because, again, you have that global supply issue. You also have to think about the fact that if there's a state that is located in a closer fashion to the Middle East and they get most of their oil there and they start to buy it from the United States, you're paying a massive upcharge for shipping costs. That's just kind of basic economics. Again, I'm not claiming to be an expert on that, but I think that's just kind of an obvious point. The ships have to go further in order to supply them. They're going to have to charge more for shipping. That's going to be a continuing issue here. And again, kind of want to point back to Trump claiming that the other countries had the easy part. Well, not many of these countries have large armies or military expertise in order to execute this easy part of the plan. And on top of that, we're kind of forced into this by the United States. I don't think many countries, and I could be wrong on this, but I don't think many countries expected to or wanted the United States to do something as drastic as attack Iran directly. And in doing so, they were forced into this situation. Now, doing the quote unquote easy part is something that they may not want to do, especially if you are a neighbor to Iran. You don't necessarily have a adversarial relationship. There's a possibility that they don't want to get directly tied into an attack on Iran because, if you're closer to Iran, you are in the firing sites of that country. And I think as we've known over the past 20 or 30 years, they have no problem attacking their enemies, especially when within range. Why put yourself at the end of that gun sight? I think that it's a major issue that it's possible that Trump did not oversee. Now, the ramifications that are back home, I mean, the obvious one, of course, is that fuel prices, oil prices have gone up tremendously. But there's also another issue that kind of referenced the last time we talked about this war, but I want to bring back up, and that is the tangential rise in cost that's going to come along with these increased prices. Of course, anything that's going to be shipped on a truck or even something that's using shipping via the naval passages, anything that requires the use of fuel is going to increase in price because of shipping direct. And I think that that's pretty easily understood. But something else that's not as much in the forefront and not thought about too much is the fact that cost of fertilizer has now gone up somewhere around 30 to 50%. With the cost of fertilizer going up, I think you all know where I'm going with this. Cost of agriculture and farming is going up precipitously. With that being said, on top of the fact that that food that's being grown needs to be brought somewhere using most likely oil and fuel that has gone up in price. If the baseline way of growing crop and securing enough crop in order to sell, which is fertilizer, is also going up, then we're going to see food prices increasing rapidly at rates that I think could mirror or possibly even outgrow what happened during COVID. And that's a scary, scary thought. Food prices and economic issues in terms of affordability have been pretty terrible over the past 5 to 7 years. And with that said, things seem like they're going in an even worse direction. When you think about something, an issue that I've always talked about on this show here, and on many other shows, is the issue of inflation. Now, if you're going to talk about inflation, the core issue is that things generally don't come down in price. Very rarely are you going to see something other than maybe gas when something goes up in price and it doesn't stay there. Like the best thing that could possibly happen once something has inflated in price is that it levels out for a long enough time that the cost of living, wage increases that generally speaking are the only way Americans find more dollars in their paycheck, catch up to that inflated price while it stagnates. What we're seeing now is that after years and years of pretty heavy inflation, well above the target 2%, which we're not going to get into today, but is a whole heap of bullshit in its own right. This inflation is going to be pretty significantly above that, if I had to wager. And we've already not caught up as the average American. We have not caught up to being able to afford things at their already inflated state. So with this increased inflation, things economically speaking are not great. And that's not to mention all of the other domestic issues that we're not really going to get into today. But on the whole, I want you guys to kind of follow along with me here where I'm saying, this whole issue of closing the Strait of Hormuz wasn't even on the table until the United States and Israel decided to attack Iran. And furthermore, the amount of issues that are coming along to the United States in the domestic area are compounding on top of themselves, whether you're talking about the global price for oil and petroleum products, or whether you're talking about things like tangentially related, something like fertilizer that might end up affecting us even more. So one of the worst things that's come out of this war, just kind of moving on to this because I want to talk about it a little bit, is that there has been a pretty high number of civilian targets that are being attacked by the United States and Israel. Now, every time one of these comes out, it's hard to ascertain whether the United States was at fault, whether Israel was at fault, or a combination of both. You had that girls' school probably like 4 weeks ago or so. It was pretty close to the start of this engagement. But recently, you're starting to see universities being gone after. You're starting to see like pharmacies, drug manufacturers gone after. And one of the big threats that Trump was kind of throwing out there during his speech, but also just throughout the past few weeks, is that if Iran doesn't want to come to the table and negotiate, or if the negotiations are falling through, then he's thinking about attacking energy infrastructure. Energy infrastructure, at the end of the day, yes, it can definitely help out, and it does help out the state. I don't want to underplay that. It does help out military operations for Iran. It does all of that. But at the end of the day, the most affected people of that are the civilian population. And it seems to be something that's kind of following along the lines of what Israel was kind of perpetrating against the Gazans and the Palestinians in the most recent Gaza. And it's just disturbing to think that the United States military is getting used in this way. Now, whether Donald Trump directly or his cabinet directly is to blame for this, or whether it's more of a mission that's led by bad intel supplied by somebody else, possibly Israel, it's yet to be seen. And quite frankly, it may never be seen, the exact truth. If, for instance, ordnance was used by the United States on a civilian drop, and I don't think you're ever going to find out where that intel came from. In most cases, you think back to things like the Iraq or Afghanistan war during the early 2000s, there were many, many instances where the soldiers would have comments something like, yeah, I had the ability to go after a high value target, and instead I was pulled back because of the possibility of civilian casualty that would have came along with it. And that's not a one-off. That happens many, many times, and even was one of the major reasons that Trump got elected in 2016, was that he wanted to allow our troops to prosecute whatever or go after any sort of means that would have militarily given us an advantage, whether there was issues with civilian targets or not. Now, during his first term, there wasn't too many opportunities like this one here, but now it seems like he has kind of come through on that promise roughly 10 years later, and it's disturbing. One of the best reasons to say that the United States was the good guy, so to speak, or was the good actor on the world stage, was that we did everything in our power to avoid civilian casualty. We did everything in our power to make sure that the government that we were dealing with, whoever we were fighting, had a reason to come to the negotiating table and make a deal in order to get out of the conflict. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that you're not going after civilians. You're not purposely going after things like schools, like hospitals. And it makes you, all you're doing is targeting military, and you're doing it effectively. It makes, you would think, the other side want to come to the negotiating table because they can't perpetrate the war in the way that they would want to. Now that has gone in the reverse, it seems, with this recent strikes on Iran and the fact that we are almost seemingly on purpose going after targets that are civilian laden or civilian infrastructure. Whether you want to talk about factories, whether you want to talk about energy infrastructure, whether you want to talk about hospitals, you're going after the civilian population. And that, just psychologically, if you imagine it happening in your neighborhood, is going to affect you in a way that you are not going to want to capitulate. You're not going to want to come to the negotiating table to come up with a deal. You're going to want to fight back, and you're going to want to fight back because it's your daughters, your sisters, your sons that are getting widely hurt by these actions. It's interesting to see that this is the way that things have kind of devolved the Trump administration, the way that they're going about perpetrating this war, so to speak. But it's also really disturbing. Again, we used to hold ourselves to a different standard, and now it looks like that standard is not being upheld. And it's really hard to watch as our country is becoming everything that we claim to hate. Now, lastly, the one thing that I think is the most disturbing to most Americans is the fact that there is a large consideration of utilizing ground troops in Iran. Now, what you keep seeing is numbers like, 2,000 Marines here. There's special ops that are coming in somewhere in the number of 2,000 to 3,000 people. When you look at it as the whole and everybody that we have stationed around, we have roughly 50,000, give or take 5 or 10,000 one way or the other of personnel that are in the area. So it's not like we're limited to something like a 2,000 men ground troop. We have a decent amount of people to utilize there if Trump wants. And that is one of the scariest things. You listen to, a former soldier that was in Iraq. You have a former soldier that was in Afghanistan. To think that we're going to put out a ground force into Iran and think that we are going to come out of that in any reasonable time frame, or B, come out unscathed or without major casualties on our side is folly. It's what you hear every single vet saying if they're going to come on to an interview and try to speak their mind about this, is that this is a terrible idea. And yet, really, if you think about what it takes to actually perform a regime change in terms of war, there is no reliable way of doing that without having the security of having your own forces to basically uphold the power of the regime that you want. Now, I'm not saying you as in you that's listening to this. I'm not saying you as in like me that's perpetrating this. I'm saying you as in whatever power is trying to upend another power. And in this case, this is the Trump administration and the Netanyahu government in Israel attempting to oust the Ayatollah regime. What we kind of, I think, need to keep in mind here is that you wouldn't have this many people stationed. You wouldn't have people going out there if you weren't planning on utilizing them. It's an extreme waste of resources to have them over there in the first place. It's a waste of resources to have more people out there. So at the end of the day, as much as I think most Americans are really hoping that it doesn't get to the point of utilizing our troops on the ground in Iran, you have to expect it, unfortunately. And as soon as that mission is a go, as soon as we have our ground troops on the actual state of Iran, I think that unfortunately what we need to be prepared for is a really long war that probably is going to span past this presidency. There is really no way in my mind that it stays as just a kind of air conflict by using our Air Force and the amount of, high value military planes that we have. And there's really no way to effectuate the regime change that they are looking to do. Now, I think a good point to be made is this is exactly why you don't get into conflicts like this. You don't really have much control. You are really at the behest of another government in terms of trying to make it fall the way that you want. But at this point, it's so far past that the Trump administration doesn't really seem to care about the opinions of the average American people. They care about those people that are completely in their pocket, that are going to listen to anything that they prescribe and are going to go along with anything as long as it is to what that person's personal ambition is. They don't care about anybody who is willing to speak up. They will go out and trash someone like Joe Kent for speaking his mind and not wanting to get involved. This is just going to continue to happen. And my guess is that the crappier side of things is going to unfold over the next few months. just my guess, I would happily be wrong on this, and I would love for anybody to post any sort of articles that point towards another way. But unfortunately, the only real information that we're getting saying that this conflict might be coming to an end is coming from Trump himself, and he has a pretty large incentive to claim that. We've seen a pretty bad hit on the stock market. We have seen economic spending going down as people are kind of hunkering down for what is possibly to come. He has the incentive to try to damage control this in the PR sense of things, and it's not really working, I think, has been made obvious. And yeah, I can't trust someone that has that incentive. Everything that I'm reading from someone who, it's either reporters that have been over there, it's reporters who are following the behind the scenes stuff. Everything that I'm seeing says there is no end in sight here. There is no true negotiation happening. And when that's the case, it's a scary point, but we're not going to be out of this anytime soon. So I hope you all are kind of keeping your eye on the news. Don't get too swallowed into it, I think, is another thing too. We have our whole lives to live over here in the United States. Stay vigilant. Things can always happen around you that are, downstream effects of what this war is, whether you're talking about terror, whether you're talking about false flags. Just be on the lookout, keep yourself safe, and, keep yourself running so that you don't really go crazy. Because at the end of the day, one of the worst things that we could do is become completely swallowed in this when we have really no say. I think our best say is in the next election to really hand it to the Trump administration, whether that is by voting for the other side or abstaining from a vote altogether. Going against this and making it pretty obvious that the American people don't stand for this, I think, is our only way of showing that this is not something that we support. So with all that said, I hope everything is good with you guys. I hope you had a nice Easter. If you don't celebrate Easter, I hope you had a nice Passover or anything else that you're celebrating that I'm too ignorant. I hope you had a great week and weekend, and I hope that things continue to get better. And I hope next week that I have something that is of good news to share with you. Hopefully this train doesn't keep running off the tracks. For listening, I am your host, Sal Assante. This has been the Patriots podcast. I will see you all next week.
I wish I would have fucking stayed. I wanna be something, not nothing. Trapped inside my dream and I'm running away from these demons. But the feeling's so good, I'ma keep dreaming.